So again, when we think about how climate change has affected and will continue to affect bears, we come back to this paradox that even though bears are adaptable omnivores, they are not indifferent to the abundance and quality of foods in their environment. Um, I think there's no better example of how climate change has affected bears and will continue to affect bears than grizzlies in Yellowstone. Um, we at one time, stone pine seeds were probably the most important bear food for female bears in the ecosystem. You know, a high fat content food available to these females and in safe places, places that were safe not only from people but also from male bears that could kill their cubs. But because of climate change, climate warming, we had an eruption of a little beetle called the bark beetle that got into the white bark pine, the stone pines, in these high elevations, in a realm where these beetles never could have survived because it was too cold. And in a 10-year period, this is 10 years, a single decade, 70% of the mature white bark pine in the ecosystem was killed and will not be coming back because the climate envelope for white bark pine is disappearing. And what that triggered was a dramatic change in diet on the part of females in particular, to where they ended up eating more meat to compensate for the loss of white bark pine. But by eating more meat, they were putting themselves and their cubs at greater risk because they spent more time near adult male bears. Mortality rates of cubs went up. It also meant that females were seeking out the remains of red deer that were killed by hunters during the fall, trying to scavenge those remains. Because of that, they were getting into more conflicts with hunters and being killed at a higher rate. At one time, cutthroat trout, trout that spawned in these streams around Yellowstone Lake, were a critically important food for bears in a major part of this ecosystem. We lost 90% of the trout in a 15-year period, with fairly dramatic effects on the bears. By virtue of losing the trout, the bears shifted to preying more heavily on red deer calves, which affected the red deer populations, which drove the red deer populations down. I mean, contributed to driving them down, which meant paradoxically there were fewer red deer for the bears to eat. So it entrained this whole series of dynamics that nobody ever could have anticipated. I had mentioned army cutworm moths, which live up in the alpine at the tops of the mountains. They subsist, they depend on nectar from alpine tundra flowers. And every single projection is for that environment, that alpine environment, to essentially disappear. And that's going to happen within the next 70 to 100 years. So that critically important food will go away. And it begs the question then, what are bears going to be eating? It's probably going to be cows. It's probably going to be livestock. Increasingly probably human foods. So climate change matters. And again, this is just about one ecosystem, but I would argue that whether it's detrimental to bears or not, I think the key point is we cannot predict what climate change will bring. So at the very least, that there's a lot of uncertainty. And that, again, invites humility on our part.
Okay, so what managers can do?
At this point in time, there's not much that a wildlife manager on the ground can probably do to stop climate change or increasing human populations, which is probably more of a problem in our part of the world, maybe than in Italy, I don't know. But there's too many people in any case. Wildlife managers can't control how many of us there are. They can't control what's happening with the climate. So I guess the trite answer is that to the extent possible, wildlife managers need to help create a greater space for bears to live in. And I think that space can be literal. It can be literal space, like more acres or hectares of ground where bears can find food. But I think it also has a lot to do with the space in our own heads.